The phone rang at 3:17 in the morning. In my line of work, that usually means someone's world has just turned upside down. I've learned to recognize the difference between a drunk dial and genuine terror, and the voice on the other end was definitely the latter. "Mr. Holloway, my name is Eleanor Sinclair. I represent Highland Heritage Tourism. We need your help immediately." Her Scottish accent was thick with exhaustion and something else I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Or desperation. I reached for my leather notebook, already knowing this wasn't going to be a routine consultation. "What's the situation, Ms. Sinclair?" "We purchased Blackmore Castle 6 months ago, 14th century fortress in the Scottish Highlands. We were planning to convert it into a luxury hotel, but..." Her voice trailed off and I heard papers shuffling in the background. Strange things have been happening. How renovation crews refuse to work there anymore. I clicked my pen and started writing. After 267 paranormal investigations, I've learned that the initial call tells you almost everything you need to know. The trick is listening to what they're not saying as much as what they are. What kind of strange things? Cold spots that move through the building, tools going missing, then reappearing in impossible locations. Workers hearing voices speaking what sounds like Old Gaelic, but it's gotten worse in the past week. Much worse. There it was. The escalation. That's when you know you're dealing with something genuinely supernatural rather than overactive imaginations or elaborate pranks. "Tell me about the past week." Eleanor's breathing became audible over the connection. 3 workers have quit. They all reported the same thing, seeing figures in medieval armor walking the corridors. "Not glimpses or shadows, Mr. Holloway. Full manifestations. One man swears he watched an entire battle play out in the Great Hall." I made notes about the visual phenomena while she continued. Medieval armor suggested the spirits were tied to the castle's original period, which meant we were likely dealing with residual hauntings or something more interactive. The fact that multiple witnesses were seeing identical manifestations pointed toward the latter. "Has anyone been physically harmed?" "Not yet, but yesterday our site foreman, Douglas McCready, he's worked construction for 30 years, not easily spooked. He called me in hysterics, said he went down to the castle's lower levels to check on some electrical work and found symbols carved into the stone walls. Fresh symbols, Mr. Holloway, cut deep into rock that's been there for centuries." That made me sit up straighter. Spontaneous symbol generation is rare and usually indicates something powerful trying to communicate, or worse, trying to manifest more fully in our reality. Did he photograph these symbols? That's just it. He tried, but none of the photos came out. The camera malfunctioned every time he pointed it at the walls down there. Electronic interference with recording equipment. Another classic indicator that we were dealing with significant paranormal activity. I glanced at my vintage flashlight sitting on the nightstand. Unlike modern electronics, older equipment tends to function more reliably in high-energy supernatural environments. It's one reason I still carry gear that most investigators would consider obsolete. "Ms. Sinclair, I need to ask you something important. Has anyone researched the castle's history thoroughly? I'm talking about more than just architectural records or ownership transfers. We had a historian compile a basic report for marketing purposes, but nothing extensive. Why? Because understanding what happened in a location is crucial to understanding what might still be happening there. Violent deaths, ritualistic activities, extreme emotional trauma. These things can leave imprints that persist for centuries." I could hear her moving around, probably pacing. Client anxiety at this stage is normal, but there was something in her voice that suggested she knew more than she was telling me. "Mr. Holloway, there is one more thing. The castle has been abandoned since 1645. The entire MacLeod clan that owned it died out that year. Plague, according to the records. Entire family lines don't typically vanish from plague alone, especially not noble families with the resources to flee affected areas. That kind of complete extinction usually indicates something more violent or sudden. All at once. The records are unclear, but it appears so. The castle was sealed and never inhabited again. 3.5 centuries of accumulated psychic energy suddenly disturbed by renovation work. If the MacLeod clan died traumatically, their spiritual imprints could be reacting to the intrusion. but the fresh symbol carving suggested something more active than simple residual hauntings. I'll take the case. My standard rate for international investigations is 15,000 plus expenses. Given the apparent complexity of this situation, I'd estimate 2 weeks on site minimum. Money isn't an issue. How soon can you be here? I can fly out tomorrow afternoon, but Miss Sinclair, I need you to understand something. If this situation is as serious as you're describing, having people working in that castle right now could be dangerous. So I strongly recommend suspending all renovation activities until I can assess what we're dealing with. Already done. The site has been closed since yesterday. Smart decision. Too many clients try to maintain normal operations while paranormal activity escalates, usually resulting in someone getting hurt. Eleanor Sinclair seemed to grasp the severity of the situation, which would make my job easier. I'll need detailed floor plans, any historical documentation you have, and contact information for the workers who experienced the manifestations. I'll also need accommodation nearby, somewhere I can set up a base of operations. There's a village about 10 miles from the castle. I'll arrange everything and email you the details within the hour. After ending the call, I sat in the darkness of my apartment, listening to Portland's pre-dawn silence. Scotland would be my first international case in 3 years, and something about Eleanor Sinclair's description nagged at me. The combination of factors, sudden manifestations after centuries of dormancy, electronic interference, physical symbol generation, suggested we weren't just dealing with earthbound spirits. I pulled out my gold pocket watch, inherited from my grandfather, along with his interest in the unexplained. The antique mechanism has an unusual property. It runs backward when exposed to certain types of supernatural energy. It saved my life more than once by providing early warning when something dangerous is nearby. The watch was running normally, but that would change soon enough. As I started packing my investigation kit, I couldn't shake the feeling that Blackmore Castle was about to become case number 268 for a very good reason. The next morning brought the familiar ritual of preparation. I methodically packed my leather investigation bag with the tools that had served me through 267 previous cases. The vintage flashlight, its brass fittings worn smooth from years of use, went in first alongside spare batteries. My leather-bound notebook, pages already thick with documentation from countless encounters, found its usual place beside my grandfather's compass. The antique instrument had proven invaluable in detecting magnetic anomalies that often accompany supernatural manifestations. My grandfather's gold pocket watch went into my vest pocket, its familiar weight a constant reminder of the unseen forces I dedicated my life to understanding. The watch had been running normally since yesterday's call, but I knew that would change once I reached Scotland. It always did, when something genuinely dangerous was stirring. The flight to Edinburgh gave me time to review Eleanor Sinclair's email. She'd been thorough, sending detailed architectural plans of Blackmore Castle along with what historical records Heritage Scotland had maintained. The documents painted a grim picture of the MacLeod clan's final years. Built in 1598 by Hamish MacLeod, on land previously occupied by a much older stone circle, the castle had been designed as both fortress and family seat. The MacLeods had ruled their small section of the Highlands with typical medieval brutality, but their downfall came from something darker than political warfare. According to fragmentary church records from nearby Kilmorgan village, the clan had been accused of practicing the old religion alongside Christianity. References to heathen rites in the castle's depths appeared multiple times in correspondence between local clergy and Edinburgh authorities. The accusations might have been dismissed as sectarian politicking, except for what happened in 1645. The siege that ended the MacLeods wasn't recorded in any official military document. Instead, church records spoke of a plague of shadows that swept through the castle, leaving no survivors. Government forces found the fortress empty except for bodies, all bearing signs of extreme terror. The official explanation blamed contaminated grain, but survivors from the attacking force reported seeing things in the castle that defied rational explanation. Most telling were the accounts of electronic equipment failures that had begun plaguing renovation crews 2 weeks ago. Modern technology failing in specific patterns around supernatural activity wasn't coincidence. It was a warning sign that whatever had claimed the MacLeods was stirring again after 4 centuries of dormancy. The rental car Eleanor had arranged was waiting at Edinburgh Airport, along with detailed directions to the village of Kilmorgan. The drive through the Highlands took 3 hours, winding through increasingly remote countryside as civilization gradually gave way to ancient landscape. The further north I traveled, the more the terrain seemed untouched by modern influence. These were lands where old beliefs died hard, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural had always been thin. Kilmorgan turned out to be exactly what I'd expected, a collection of stone buildings hugging the shore of a dark loch, population maybe 200. The villagers I encountered were polite but distant, their expressions closing off whenever I mentioned Blackmore Castle. That reaction alone told me everything I needed to know about the local reputation of my destination. The bed and breakfast Eleanor had booked was clean but Spartan, run by an elderly woman named Mrs. McBride, who clearly disapproved of my purpose. She served me dinner in silence, but as I prepared to retire to my room, she finally spoke. "You'll be wanting to stay away from that place after dark." Her Highland accent was thick, but her meaning was unmistakable. Nothing good has walked those halls for longer than memory serves. I thanked her for the warning, though I suspected she knew I wouldn't heed it. In my experience, supernatural activity intensifies after sunset, making nighttime investigations both dangerous and necessary. Whatever was awakening at Blackmore Castle would reveal itself most clearly when darkness fell. My pocket watch began running slow as I drove the final 10 miles to the castle the next evening. The irregularity was subtle at first, losing perhaps 30 seconds over the course of the drive, but the deviation increased as I approached the ruins. By the time I parked at the base of the hill where Blackmore stood, the watch was running nearly 5 minutes behind. The castle loomed against the darkening sky like a wound in the landscape. 4 centuries of Highland weather had stained the grey stone almost black, and several towers had partially collapsed, creating jagged silhouettes against the clouds. Even from a distance, I could feel the oppressive atmosphere that clung to the structure. This wasn't just abandonment and decay. Something actively malevolent had made those ruins its home. I checked my equipment one final time before approaching the main gate. The flashlight's beam was steady, the compass needle pointing true north without deviation. My notebook and pen were secure in the coat's inner pocket. Most importantly, the pocket watch was now running backward, its hands moving counterclockwise at an increasingly rapid pace. Whatever waited inside Blackmore Castle was already aware of my presence. The main gate stood open, though I couldn't tell if that was deliberate or simply the result of rusted hinges finally giving way. Fresh tire tracks in the courtyard mud marked where the renovation crew's vehicles had been parked before Eleanor ordered the evacuation. Tool marks on several stones showed where work had begun on structural assessment, but the tools themselves had been abandoned in what appeared to be considerable haste. The symbol Eleanor had described was carved into the lintel above the Great Hall's entrance. The Celtic knotwork was intricate, clearly the product of skilled craftsmanship, but the stone around it showed no signs of weathering. This carving was recent, created by something that had emerged from the castle's depths in response to the renovation work. As I crossed the threshold into the Great Hall, my pocket watch began spinning wildly, its hands moving in both directions simultaneously. The temperature dropped noticeably, and my breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. I was no longer alone in Blackmore Castle. The investigation was about to begin in earnest, and after 267 previous cases, I knew the signs. Whatever the MacLeods had awakened in their final desperate hours was stirring again, drawn by the disturbance of 4 centuries of undisturbed slumber. I opened my notebook and began to write. Case number 268 had officially begun. The first night at Blackmore had confirmed my worst suspicions. The entity within those walls was ancient, predatory, and now fully aware of my presence. As dawn broke over the Highlands, painting the castle walls in pale gold light, I made my way down the winding mountain road toward the village of Kilmarnock. My pocket watch had returned to normal function with the sunrise, ticking steadily in my coat pocket, but the memory of its wild spinning lingered like a phantom sensation. I needed answers that wouldn't be found within those haunted walls. After 13 years in homicide and over 7 investigating the paranormal, I'd learned that understanding the past was crucial to confronting the present. Every malevolent entity I'd encountered had roots in human tragedy, trauma that had festered and transformed into something far worse than the original pain. The MacLeods of Blackmore had secrets, and those secrets were buried in archives, church records, and local memory. The village of Kilmarnock consisted of perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a small church and a single main street. Stone cottages with slate roofs huddled together as if seeking protection from the Highland winds, their windows glowing warm against the morning chill. I parked outside the Kilmarnock Heritage Centre, a converted Victorian schoolhouse that served as the local museum and archive. A hand-painted sign in the window advertised guided tours of historic clan battlefields and genealogical research services. The woman behind the reception desk looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She introduced herself as Agnes McBride, the centre's director and the village's unofficial historian. When I explained that I was researching the MacLeod clan and their connection to Blackmore Castle, her expression shifted from welcoming curiosity to visible concern. Agnes led me to a back room lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets, archival boxes, and bound volumes of local records dating back centuries. The musty smell of old paper and leather bindings filled the air, familiar and comforting after years of similar research. She pulled several boxes from the shelves and set them on a wooden table that had seen decades of scholarly work. The earliest records painted a picture of the MacLeods as a powerful Highland clan, fierce warriors who had held Blackmore Castle for nearly 50 years before their mysterious downfall in 1645. Birth records, marriage certificates, and property deeds created a genealogical map of a family tree that ended abruptly and violently. According to the church records, the entire clan had perished within a single winter, victims of what the parish priest had described as divine judgment for their unholy practices. Agnes sat across from me as I worked through the documents, occasionally offering translations of Gaelic phrases or historical context for names and dates. Her knowledge of local history was encyclopedic, passed down through generations of Highland families who had witnessed the MacLeod's rise and catastrophic fall. When I asked about the specific circumstances of the clan's extinction, her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap. The most revealing document was a letter dated March 15, 1645, written by Father Malcolm Sinclair, the parish priest assigned to Blackmore. His handwriting was shaky. The ink faded to brown, but his words painted a horrifying picture of the MacLeod's final months. The clan had been besieged by rival Highland forces for nearly 6 months, trapped within their castle walls as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. Supplies had dwindled, and desperation had driven them to increasingly extreme measures. Father Sinclair described rituals conducted in the castle's deepest chambers, ceremonies that borrowed from pagan traditions far older than Christianity's arrival in Scotland. The clan's patriarch, Laird Hamish MacLeod, had apparently consulted ancient texts and sought supernatural aid to break the siege. The priest's final entries spoke of terrible sounds echoing from beneath the castle, of clansmen who emerged from the depths fundamentally changed, their eyes reflecting an inhuman intelligence that filled the father with dread. The siege had ended not with victory or defeat, but with silence. When rival forces finally breached the castle walls in early spring, they found the MacLeods dead to a man. No signs of battle, no evidence of disease or starvation. The bodies were discovered in the Great Hall, arranged in ritualistic patterns around symbols carved into the stone floor. The survivors from the besieging army reported that the castle felt wrong, that something malevolent had taken residence within its walls. Agnes retrieved another box from the archives, this one containing newspaper clippings and official reports from the 19th and 20th centuries. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. Every few decades, someone would attempt to restore or occupy Blackmore Castle. Archaeological expeditions, historical societies, even a brief attempt by the government to convert it into a military outpost during World War II. Each effort ended the same way: unexplained accidents, psychological breakdowns among workers, and eventually complete abandonment. A yellowed newspaper clipping from 1923 described the mysterious death of Professor Edmund Hartwell, an archaeologist from Edinburgh University, who had been excavating the castle's lower levels. His assistant reported finding the professor in the castle's depths, apparently aged decades overnight, his hair white and his face bearing the expression of someone who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the assistant's testimony spoke of whispered voices in ancient Gaelic and shadows that moved independent of any light source. More recent reports followed similar patterns. A restoration attempt in 1967 ended when 3 workers suffered simultaneous nervous breakdowns and claimed to have been attacked by medieval warriors who appeared from thin air. A paranormal investigation team in 1985 fled after their equipment malfunctioned, and their leader reported being physically assaulted by an invisible presence that left genuine injuries. As I compiled my notes, Agnes shared stories passed down through local families, tales that had evolved from historical fact into Highland folklore. The villagers of Kilmarnock had learned to give Blackmore Castle a wide berth, understanding that whatever the MacLeods had awakened in their desperation had never truly departed. Generation after generation had watched outsiders arrive with plans to restore or investigate the ruins, and generation after generation had witnessed those same outsiders flee in terror or worse. The pattern was unmistakable. The entity within Blackmore Castle wasn't simply a residual haunting, the psychic echo of past trauma. This was something actively malevolent, something that had been deliberately summoned by Laird Hamish MacLeod in his final desperate gambit to save his clan. Instead of salvation, he had invited damnation, binding his family's souls to serve a force far older and more powerful than human understanding could encompass. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the archive room, I closed the final folder and secured my notebook within my coat. The historical research had confirmed what my instincts had already suggested. Blackmore Castle housed something that predated Christianity, predated civilization itself, something the MacLeods had foolishly believed they could control. The drive back to Blackmore Castle through the darkening Scottish Highlands carried a weight I hadn't felt since my earliest days investigating the paranormal. Agnes had offered to accompany me, but I declined. Whatever had claimed the MacLeod clan and countless others who dared enter those ruins needed to be confronted with methodical precision, not the emotional baggage of local folklore and generational fear. The castle's silhouette emerged against the dusky sky like a monument to human hubris. Its broken towers and crumbling battlements stark reminders of mortality's ultimate victory over earthly power. I parked my rental at the same distance as before, close enough for a quick retreat, but far enough to avoid drawing immediate attention from whatever presence dwelled within those stones. The leather of my investigation notebook felt familiar against my palm as I secured it within my trench coat, the vintage flashlight heavy in my right hand. My inherited pocket watch hung silent against my chest, though I suspected that silence wouldn't last long once I crossed the threshold into Blackmore's shadow. The main courtyard appeared different in the fading daylight, somehow more oppressive despite the natural illumination. Stone blocks that had seemed merely weathered during my morning reconnaissance now bore darker stains, as though centuries of Highland rain had failed to cleanse them of whatever blood had once flowed across their surfaces. The air itself felt thicker, carrying scents of decay and something else, something organic that reminded me of the aftermath of violent death scenes from my homicide detective years. Moving through the castle's ground level, I methodically documented architectural details that might prove relevant to understanding the entity's manifestation patterns. The great hall stretched before me, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to move independent of my flashlight beam. Massive stone fireplaces dominated both ends of the chamber, their hearths blackened not just by centuries of fires, but by something that had burned with unnatural intensity. Tattered banners still clung to iron brackets along the walls, their heraldic designs obscured by age and what appeared to be deliberate defacement. The temperature began dropping as I approached the hall's far end, where a narrow stone staircase descended into the castle's lower levels. My pocket watch stirred against my chest, the familiar weight shifting slightly as though responding to some invisible magnetic field. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, the first indication that whatever presence inhabited Blackmoor Castle was becoming aware of my intrusion. Descending those worn stone steps, I noticed how the air grew increasingly stale, carrying undertones of something far more disturbing than mere age and neglect. The flashlight beam revealed walls carved directly from the Highland bedrock, their surfaces bearing the tool marks of medieval masons who had labored to create chambers that were never meant for human comfort. Celtic symbols covered portions of the stonework, not carved with the reverent precision of religious devotion, but scratched into the rock with desperate urgency, as though their creators had worked against some terrible deadline. The first basement level opened into what had once served as storage chambers for the castle's provisions. Rotted timber shelves lined the walls, their contents long since consumed by time and vermin, leaving only iron brackets and scattered pottery fragments. But it was the floor that commanded my attention, specifically the intricate pattern of grooves carved into the stone itself. The markings formed concentric circles radiating outward from a central point, intersected by lines of symbols that hurt to look at directly, as though my mind instinctively recoiled from comprehending their meaning. Moving deeper into the castle's foundations, I discovered what the historical records had only hinted at, the chamber where Laird Hamish MacLeod had performed his final desperate ritual. The room was circular, carved entirely from living rock, with alcoves positioned at precise intervals around the perimeter. Each alcove contained the remnants of iron shackles, their metal corroded, but still bearing dark stains that time had failed to erase. The central floor featured an elaborate pattern of carved channels, all converging toward a raised stone platform that dominated the chamber's heart. The platform itself was a masterwork of medieval craftsmanship, perverted toward unholy purpose. Standing 7 feet in diameter and carved from a single massive stone, its surface bore inscriptions in multiple languages, Latin phrases intermingled with Gaelic script and symbols that predated both Christian and Celtic traditions. The stone's color was wrong, too dark for Highland granite, too smooth for natural rock, as though it had been transformed by whatever forces had been channeled through its substance. My pocket watch began ticking audibly for the first time since entering the castle, its rhythm irregular and unsettling. The temperature continued dropping, my breath now visible in small puffs that dissipated slowly in the stagnant air. The flashlight beam flickered momentarily, not from mechanical failure, but as though something was interfering with the electrical current itself. Standing beside the ritual platform, I could feel the epicenter of Blackmoor Castle's malevolent presence. This chamber was where 4 centuries ago, a desperate Scottish laird had sacrificed members of his own clan in a futile attempt to summon salvation. Instead of divine intervention, Hamish MacLeod had invited something ancient and hungry into the physical world, binding it to his bloodline and trapping both human and inhuman entities within these stones. The walls around the ritual chamber bore additional evidence of the ceremony's aftermath. Scratch marks gouged deep into the rock surface suggested desperate attempts to escape, while darker stains splattered across the stone told stories of violence that had continued long after the original sacrifice. Most disturbing were the handprints pressed into the wall at various heights, some adult-sized, others heartbreakingly small, all preserved in substances that had hardened over the centuries into permanent memorials of terror. As I documented these discoveries in my notebook, the pocket watch's ticking grew more erratic, occasionally stopping entirely before resuming with increased intensity. The entity was responding to my presence, awakening after decades of dormancy to assess this new intruder who dared violate its domain. But unlike the terrified workers and investigators who had fled at the first sign of supernatural activity, I remained methodical in my approach, understanding that knowledge was the only weapon effective against forces that existed beyond physical reality. The ritual chamber represented more than historical curiosity or paranormal phenomenon. It was a gateway that Laird Hamish MacLeod had torn open between dimensions, a wound in reality itself that had never properly healed. Whatever entity he had summoned had been feeding on the psychic energy of subsequent visitors for 4 centuries, growing stronger with each new source of terror and despair. Today's reconnaissance had confirmed my worst suspicions about what awaited within Blackmoor Castle's shadows. I closed the notebook and secured it in my trench coat's inner pocket, the leather binding still warm from documenting the ritual chamber's disturbing evidence. The pocket watch continued its irregular rhythm against my chest, each tick seeming to echo off the stone walls with unnatural resonance. My breath formed heavier clouds in the increasingly frigid air as I backed away from the obsidian platform, keeping the flashlight beam trained on the altar's surface, until shadows swallowed it completely. The ascent from the dungeon felt different than my earlier descent. Where before the stone steps had seemed merely worn smooth by centuries of use, now they felt deliberately treacherous, as though the castle itself was attempting to impede my progress. The flashlight beam revealed nothing overtly threatening, yet my peripheral vision caught subtle movements that disappeared when I turned to investigate directly. The entity was testing my reactions, probing for weaknesses in my composure that it could exploit. Reaching the main level brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere. The great hall stretched before me, its vaulted ceiling lost in darkness beyond my light's reach. Medieval tapestries hung in tatters along the walls, their once vibrant colors faded to indistinct browns and grays that seemed to shift and writhe in the moving shadows. The massive fireplace dominated the far wall, its blackened stones bearing witness to countless winters when the MacLeod clan had gathered here, unaware that their bloodline would end in supernatural horror beneath their feet. My footsteps echoed differently now, each boot heel striking stone producing not one sound, but multiple reverberations that suggested other presences moving in synchronization with my own. The pocket watch's ticking had grown loud enough to be audible over my breathing, its erratic tempo creating an unsettling counterpoint to my measured pace across the hall. Temperature readings on my compass showed the ambient air dropping steadily, now approaching levels that would be uncomfortable even with proper winter clothing. The first physical manifestation occurred as I approached the central staircase leading to the upper floors. A door along the eastern wall, which had remained firmly closed during my earlier exploration, swung open with deliberate slowness. No wind stirred the stagnant air, no structural settling could account for the movement. The hinges, rusted from centuries of highland moisture, produced no sound as the heavy oak panel revealed only deeper darkness beyond the threshold. I maintained my position near the staircase, observing the open doorway, while documenting the time and circumstances in my mental notes. The entity was beginning its campaign of psychological warfare, attempting to draw me towards specific locations within the castle. Professional experience with similar manifestations suggested that following such obvious lures often led to increased supernatural aggression, yet ignoring them completely could provoke more direct confrontation. The pocket watch stopped ticking entirely for 17 seconds, creating a silence so absolute that my own heartbeat became audible. When the mechanism resumed, its rhythm had synchronized with something else, a deeper pulse that seemed to emanate from the castle's foundations. The coordination was not coincidental. Whatever force I had awakened in the ritual chamber was now establishing a connection with objects in my possession, using my own equipment to monitor and influence my psychological state. A second door opened along the western wall, this one accompanied by the distinct sound of iron bolts withdrawing, despite the fact that my earlier inspection had revealed no functional locking mechanisms. The noise echoed through the great hall with metallic precision, each click and scrape perfectly audible in the supernatural quiet. Both doorways now gaped like empty eye sockets in the castle's stone face, their interiors concealed by shadows that seemed denser than mere absence of light. The temperature continued dropping at an accelerated rate. My compass needle began rotating slowly but continuously, indicating magnetic interference, consistent with entities that existed partially outside normal dimensional constraints. The flashlight beam dimmed perceptibly, not from battery depletion, but from external suppression of its electrical function. These were textbook symptoms of a supernatural presence drawing energy from environmental sources to fuel physical manifestations. Movement in my peripheral vision became more frequent and pronounced. Brief glimpses of figures in medieval clothing appeared at the edges of the light's reach, always vanishing when I directed the beam toward them. The appearances followed no random pattern, but seemed coordinated, as though multiple entities were positioning themselves around my location in preparation for a more direct encounter. The tactical nature of their behavior suggested intelligence rather than mere instinctual. A third door opened, this one behind me near the main entrance, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against stone. The noise continued for several seconds longer than necessary for a simple door opening, creating the impression that something heavy was being dragged across the threshold. When I turned to investigate, the flashlight revealed only empty space beyond the doorway, but fresh scratches scarred the stone floor where something had indeed been pulled inside. The pocket watch's ticking accelerated to match my increasing heart rate, creating an intimate connection between my physiological responses and the supernatural activity surrounding me. This synchronization represented a significant escalation in the entity's ability to interact with physical reality. Where moments before it had been limited to opening doors and manipulating temperature, now it was demonstrating awareness of my biological functions and the capacity to respond to them in real time. Standing in the center of the great hall with multiple doorways gaping in the darkness around me, I faced a tactical decision that would determine the remainder of this investigation. The entity was clearly attempting to herd me towards specific locations, probably areas where previous victims had been successfully trapped or traumatized. Professional protocol dictated maintaining control of my movement patterns and refusing to be manipulated into vulnerable positions. The castle's supernatural inhabitant had spent 4 centuries learning to exploit human psychology, feeding on terror and desperation to strengthen its hold on physical reality. Every investigator who had fled in panic had provided it with additional energy. Every screaming worker had contributed to its growing power. But unlike those previous encounters, this investigation was being conducted by someone with extensive experience in similar situations. Someone who understood that knowledge and composure were the only reliable defenses against entities that existed beyond conventional reality. The pocket watch stopped ticking again, this time for a full 30 seconds, while the temperature dropped another 10 degrees and all 3 open doorways simultaneously exhaled visible breaths of icy air that rolled across the stone floor like fog. The entity was preparing for its next escalation, gathering energy for a manifestation that would test the limits of my professional resolve. The manifestation began with a sound I had never encountered in 267 previous cases, a resonant humming that seemed to originate from the castle's foundation stones themselves rather than from any visible source. The frequency penetrated bone and tissue, creating vibrations in my chest cavity that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat while simultaneously fighting against it. This was not merely auditory manipulation, but something far more sophisticated, an attempt to synchronize my biological systems with whatever energy patterns governed the entity's existence. Professional experience had taught me to recognize when supernatural encounters crossed from psychological intimidation into direct physiological assault, and this humming represented exactly that threshold. My pocket watch resumed its erratic ticking, but now the sound carried an almost musical quality that harmonized with the humming emanating from the walls. The gold casing grew warm against my palm, warmer than body temperature, indicating that the inherited timepiece was responding to energy levels I could not directly perceive. Sarah had always insisted that inherited objects carried imprints from previous owners, memories encoded in metal and crystal that could bridge the gap between living consciousness and whatever existed beyond death. Standing in this ancient fortress, with her father's watch burning against my skin, I felt her presence more strongly than at any time since the shooting 13 years ago. The 3 doorways began exhaling streams of luminescent mist that coalesced into recognizable shapes as it reached the center of the great hall. Not the warrior apparitions I had observed in the lower chambers, but civilian figures dressed in period clothing, that marked them as servants, children, women who had died during the siege, rather than in combat. Their faces carried expressions of desperate pleading, hands extended toward me in gestures that spoke of unfinished business, unresolved trauma that had anchored their consciousness to this location for 4 centuries. These were not the primary entity, but victims who had been consumed by it, absorbed into its growing mass of suffering and transformed into extensions of its will. The temperature differential between the doorways and my position created air currents that pulled at my trench coat, attempting to draw me toward the passages that led deeper into the castle's interior. This was tactical herding behavior, designed to exploit human instincts that associate movement with safety, even when remaining stationary represents the wiser choice. The entity understood that people trapped in supernatural encounters typically flee toward whatever exit appears most accessible, and it was positioning these spectral figures to block my path to the main entrance, while making the interior passages seem like viable alternatives. Professional protocol required maintaining my current position until I could evaluate the full scope of the manifestation. But the pocket watch's increasing temperature suggested that remaining stationary might not be feasible for much longer. The inherited timepiece had never exhibited this level of thermal response in previous cases, which meant the energy concentration surrounding me exceeded anything I had previously encountered. Sarah's voice echoed in memory, reminding me that sometimes the most dangerous course of action is the one that appears safest. That entities with centuries of experience manipulating human behavior excel at making survival instincts work against their intended purpose. The luminescent figures began moving in coordinated patterns that resembled a formal dance, circling my position at a distance of approximately 15 feet while maintaining eye contact that felt uncomfortably intimate given their translucent nature. This was psychological warfare designed to create the impression of being surrounded, outnumbered, trapped in a situation where negotiation or escape had become impossible. But 13 years investigating homicides had taught me to recognize when seemingly overwhelming circumstances were actually elaborate bluffs designed to provoke panic responses that would compromise tactical judgment. The humming from the foundation stones intensified, and I felt rather than heard something massive moving through the lower levels of the castle, something that shook dust from the ceiling beams and caused the spectral figures to falter in their choreographed movements. The primary entity was ascending from whatever depths had contained it for 4 centuries, drawn by the energy being generated through this prolonged manifestation. My presence had indeed broken containment seals that had held it dormant, but the breaking had been gradual rather than instantaneous, allowing me time to document the process and potentially understand how those original bindings had been constructed. The pocket watch's ticking accelerated to match the approaching footsteps echoing from the main staircase, each tick corresponding to the impact of something heavy against stone steps worn smooth by generations of use. The mathematical precision of this synchronization indicated that the entity was not merely responding to my presence, but actively scanning my physiological functions, learning to predict my reactions before I became conscious of them myself. This represented a level of supernatural sophistication that explained why the castle had remained abandoned for so long, despite numerous attempts at restoration. The spectral figures suddenly collapsed back into mist, their forms dissolving as the energy sustaining them was recalled for a different purpose. The luminescent fog rushed toward the staircase like water flowing downhill, gathering into a concentrated mass that began taking shape as something climbed toward the great hall. Not human, despite the footstep sounds, but something that had learned to mimic human movement patterns while retaining its fundamentally alien nature. The temperature around my position dropped another 20 degrees in the span of 30 seconds, creating visible breath clouds that revealed the presence of supernatural energy fields invisible to normal perception. Professional instinct demanded retreat toward the main entrance, while that route remained theoretically available. But the pocket watch's thermal signature suggested that movement in any direction would trigger a more aggressive response from whatever was manifesting on the staircase. Sarah had died because she moved too quickly in a situation that required careful deliberation, and I would not repeat that mistake, regardless of how intense the pressure became. The investigation was approaching its critical phase, the moment when documentation would transition from observation to direct interaction with forces that existed beyond conventional reality. Standing motionless in my dark grey trench coat, flashlight beam steady despite the tremor in my hands, I prepared to face whatever had been sleeping beneath Blackmore Castle for 400 years, knowing that my survival depended entirely on maintaining the professional composure that had carried me through 266 previous encounters with the impossible.